Welcome, everybody, to the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host, Mike Goodpaster. Today, we're going to look at the top 10 heavyweights of the 1980s. And I want to remind you, as always, the Grueling Truth is powered by betting.net. Betting.net is your best bet for finding the online casino or sportsbook that's right for you. Make sure you check them out at betting.net. All right, guys, we're going to look at the heavyweight division of the 1980s. If you think today is bad, the 1980s wasn't. And the only issue with the 1980s is a lot of guys that had addiction issues, weight issues, and they came up a little bit short because of that. And today we're going to count down the top 10. I'm going to start off with number 10. We are going to go with Greg Page. Actually, there's a lot of guys on here that could take the number 10 spot on this list. Guys like Gerry Cooney, Michael Dokes. Greg Page is 10 for me. And my story for Greg Page is kind of a sad one. I got to meet him in Erlanger at Peel's Palace. I think it was in the early 2000s, like 2001, before what ended up being his final fight against Dale Crow. He was a really nice guy. That fight didn't end up well. It was a old Greg Page who took a beating, got hurt, and Peel's Palace, the Kentucky Boxing and Wrestling Commission, did not have an ambulance there. He ended up being 30 minutes before they got him to the ambulance. And it didn't work out well for Greg Page. His life ended in a very disturbing way because of that night. But in the early 1980s, he was from Louisville, Kentucky. So, of course, he was compared to Muhammad Ali. Early on in his career, his punching power, his speed made it look like that was possible. Probably his first name opponent at the Louisville Gardens in early 1980 was against George Chaplin. He won that fight. He would eventually beat Chaplin twice. Both fights were very close decisions that could have went either way. After that, he fought against Stan Ward for the vacant USBA heavyweight title. He won that fight. He comes back. He beats Marty Monroe, who was a tough contender. Alfredo Evangelista, who was kind of a gatekeeper. If you couldn't beat him, you couldn't win the heavyweight championship or fight for it. And then you had the Nassau Bahamas on the undercard of Ali and Holmes. You had him fight Scott Ledoux. Now, I remember when I talked to Greg Page a day before the Dale Crow fight, him talking about right around this point, right around the Stan Ward fight, where his father, who had trained him, passed away, and the kind of effect it had on him. And, of course, the biggest negative effect was getting him hooked up with a guy like Don King. But the Scott Ledoux fight was a fight where he basically clowned on Scott Ledoux, who was past his prime, but a tough guy. He stops Ledoux. His next fight, he fights Jimmy Young. Jimmy Young was an excellent heavyweight who was also kind of ruined by Don King for different reasons. But Jimmy Young showed up in shape for this fight. He put up a fight. Greg Page beat him. We fast forward to June 11th, 1982, one of the biggest heavyweight title fights of all time. Larry Holmes against Gerry Cooney. On the undercard of that fight was basically Trevor Berbick, who nobody really heard of before, who we'll hear of again on this list. And he lost to Trevor Berbick. Berbick basically imposed his will on Page. Page boxed well, but Berbick was too strong for him. That was his first loss. He followed that up by fighting James Quick Tillis, who had challenged Mike Weaver for the heavyweight title and lost the decision. He stopped James Quick Tillis in the 8th round. That was in November on the undercard of Larry Holmes versus Randall Tex Cobb. So his career was back on track. He then follows it up with a win over Larry Frazier, who was a tough guy. He beats Renaldo Snipes by a unanimous decision, and that leads to a heavyweight championship fight, WBC version, against Tim Witherspoon in early 1984. He lost a majority decision to Witherspoon, and then he followed that up with a loss to David Bay. David Bay was a guy who, of course, fought Larry Holmes for the heavyweight title. David Bay was another one of those guys who had weight issues, never really turned out to be as good as what he could. But then he gets a title shot for some reason. I guess that is one of the good things with being with Don King. Even after the Witherspoon and Bay losses, he got a shot in Johannesburg, South Africa against Harry Coetzee. He ended up struggling with Coetzee the first 7 rounds. Coetzee got tired, as he tended to do, and Coetzee is a guy we'll also talk about on this show. But he stopped Coetzee. The round went like 4 minutes. And he stopped Coetzee in that. So you would think, he weighs 236 pounds for that fight, that now maybe he's going to take this seriously. Everybody always talks about how being a champion makes you such a percentage better. Was not the case. because then he goes to the Memorial Auditorium in Buffalo to fight Tony Tubbs on April 29th to defend his recently won WBA heavyweight title. Tony Tubbs beats him by unanimous decision. It was lackluster for both of the guys. And Tony Tubbs is another guy. Weight issues, addiction problems, basically destroyed what could have been a great career. After that, he follows it up with another loss. He loses to James Buster Douglas by a unanimous decision. Nobody really knew who Douglas was at that point, but Douglas clearly beat Greg Page. And then after that, it was kind of downhill. He did get a win over James Broad, another guy with weight issues who had a lot of talent. And then he loses to Joe Bugner in 1987. Unfortunately for after that, it was all downhill for Greg Page, ending with that Dale Crow fight 20 years later in the early 2000s. So my number 10 on the list is Greg Page. If you want to say it should have been Gerry Cooney or Michael Dokes, I would not disagree with you. I just wanted to bring up Greg Page because I think he's a guy who was forgotten, who had a ton of talent, and Don King caused some issues there, but in the end, it was his own lack of work ethic. Now, number 9 on this list is Trevor Berbick. Trevor Berbick is kind of the opposite of Page and Dokes and all those guys that had all the ability in the world but never really panned out. Trevor Berbick was a guy who got, I believe, the most out of his ability. He was a crude slugger, a brawler, but he was hard to hit. I mean, Greg Page found that out in 1982. Now, Trevor Berbick burst upon the scene on the Duran Leonard undercard. He was the co-feature, and basically it was the same thing. John Tate had come off the loss a year before to Mike Weaver, who will also be on this list in a little bit. And he knocked him out with a 1 or 2 punch combination that had John Tate fall face down off the floor. If you were watching the fight as a 13-year-old like I was, you thought he killed the guy when he knocked him out. That put him on the map. That led to a year later, he fought Larry Holmes. Holmes at the time was challenging, trying to break Joe Louis's record for most consecutive knockouts in heavyweight title fights. I think it was right around 10 or 11 at this time. And Berbick fought Holmes tough. He lost the fight somewhere in the 11-4 area, 10-5. But people knew who he was after this because he went the distance with a great champion. He put up a great performance. His next event was 8 months later against Muhammad Ali at the Drama in the Bahamas. He beat Ali probably in the 8-2, 9-1 range. Ali was a shell of his former self, so it didn't really tell you a whole hell of a lot. Then he goes up and he wins the British Empire Commonwealth heavyweight title in Canada, where he beats Gordy Ratchet. Follows that up with the huge upset, gets himself back in play again with this upset over Greg Page on the Holmes-Cooney undercard, where Berbick, I think, was at the best we've ever seen him at. But then, being a heavyweight of the 80s, he screws that up by losing to Renaldo Snipes by a unanimous decision. Very close fight. Could have won either way. But then we get a fight against S.T. Gordon, which S.T. Gordon weighed like 202 pounds. And Trevor Berbick was 222. S.T. Gordon was a guy who fought Gerry Cooney a handful of years earlier and was DQ'd because basically he didn't want to fight Cooney. He ran from him. But S.T. Gordon, Trevor Berbick, one of the most boring heavyweight fights of all time. S.T. Gordon got the decision. So it looks like, we may be getting to the end of the road of Trevor Berbick. But he goes on a 5 or 6 fight win streak, 10 fight win streak against guys that you should beat. Then he fights David Bay, who we've already talked about. He stopped David Bay in the 11th round. This is a David Bay that gave Larry Holmes trouble a year before that. Then he steps up. He fights Mitch Blood Green. Mitch Blood Green at the time had a decent amateur career. He was 15-0, and Trevor Berbick beats him by a majority close decision. So he's back in play. It brings us to 1986, where he fights Pinklon Thomas. Everybody, when they talk about greatest heavyweight upsets, you always talk about, Buster Douglas over Mike Tyson, James J. Braddock, winning the title against Max Baer. Pinklon Thomas was almost a 7-1 favorite in this fight. And Pinklon Thomas was a very talented guy. We will talk about him in a little bit also, but he had addiction issues. And that was really starting to come into play, especially when you get to about 1986 with Pinklon Thomas. Trevor Berbick beats Thomas on a close decision. He outworks him. He's the heavyweight champion of the world, the WBC version. That's when, HBO has the heavyweight tournament going. So next up, after fighting Pinklon Thomas, he gets like 7 or 8 months to enjoy being a partial heavyweight champion. And then he steps into the ring against Mike Tyson. Tyson brutalizes him in 2 rounds. I will say this. Trevor Berbick was a tough dude, but Trevor Berbick's style was all wrong. As Mickey Goldman told Rocky when it came to fight, Clubber Lang, the style's all wrong for you. And Mike Tyson knocks him out in the 2nd round. So pretty much his career's done after that. He loses a unanimous decision to Carl the Truth Williams. I believe that was on the undercard of Tyson Spinks. He loses a unanimous decision to Buster Douglas about a year, almost exactly a year to the day. And that was the 80s for Trevor Berbick. But I think Trevor Berbick's the guy to get slept on because he did the most with his ability. He got a lot out of what he had, and he was a solid fighter. Now, when we go to number 8, we're going to go with Evander the Real Deal Holyfield. Now, a lot of people are going to say, why do you have Evander Holyfield on here? He only fought for a couple years in heavyweight division, and that is true. But remember, the competition is not great here when we look at the heavyweight division. We got a little message here. We got Horace, Countryman Holmes. Greetings from I Am Sports Jamaica. We love our Jamaican friends down there at I Am Sure Sports. How you doing, Horace? But we go back to number 8, which is Evander Holyfield. And the thing about Evander Holyfield, definitely also a guy who always got the most out of his ability. And at the heavyweight division, people forget it was a rapid ascension because in June, he won every version of the cruiserweight title to unify that championship. And then he moves up to heavyweight. He knocks out James Quick Tillis in the 6th round. He knocks out Pinklon Thomas in the 1st round. Those are older versions of those guys. They're not the same as what they were back in the day when they were, at their best. But they were still solid wins, especially to win over Tillis. Tillis was a smooth boxer. I think Thomas was pretty much done by then. But then after that, he does go through and he gets 2 or 3 quality wins. He beats Adelson Rodriguez, who was ranked number 2 at that time. And the big thing to me, and Countryman agrees, Holyfield outdid his way. Holyfield was Trevor Berbick with more athletic ability, I think. He was a man that worked his ass off. He was a skilled boxer, which people really forget because a lot of people forget how skilled he was. They just remember the heart. And the heart was, as Evander Holyfield had as much heart as any boxer that ever lived in any division. But you also had the win over Alex Stewart. Alex Stewart at the time was 24-0 with 24 knockouts, was considered an up-and-comer also. That was a big win. The win over Rodriguez was more the way he did it. It was a one-punch knockout. I remember you end up with snot flying out of Rodriguez's face while he's laying on the ground. And then you get Michael Dokes. Michael Dokes was a guy who should be on this list, but because of himself, he was not on this list. But for this fight, Michael Dokes was in shape. He was ready to go. It was one of the fights of the year. That's how he ended the 80s. That's why he's on this list, because of those 3 performances. Now, number 7 might seem a little bit weird. Michael Spinks, because you just remember he got knocked out in 91 seconds by Mike Tyson. But also, Michael Spinks was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, light heavyweight champions of all time. And in June 6, 1985, he beat Diamond Jim McDonald in his last defense of his light heavyweight title. 3 months later, he gains 25 pounds, moves up to fight the undefeated 48-0 Larry Holmes. He was a huge underdog. I think it was like 5-1 at the time. And he beat Holmes. And I think he clearly beat him. It was a close fight. But every time I've watched the fight, it ends up 143, 142, or 144, 141. Now, fast forward about 8 months, they fight the rematch. I thought Holmes won the rematch. I thought he won it fairly clearly, but Spinks got the decision. Spinks then fights the old Norwegian contender, Stefan Tangstedt, one of the worst heavyweight title challenge contenders of all time. He stopped Tangstedt relatively easy, and I think it was 4 or 5 rounds. And then he fights Gerry Cooney. Now, we talked about the HBO tournament to decide who the lineal heavyweight champion of the world was. Michael Spinks pulled out of that tournament. He didn't pull out because he was afraid of Tony Tucker. He pulled out because Don King offered him $350,000 to fight Tony Tucker. He got offered $3.5 million to fight Gerry Cooney. You would have had to have been stupid to fight Tucker. He fought Gerry Cooney. Cooney, massive dude. He another one of those guys with addiction problems. Alcohol was an issue for Cooney. He stops Gerry Cooney in the 5th round. That leads us to the Mike Tyson fight a year or so later. Tyson, of course, stops him in 91 seconds. It is a shame because people forget Michael Spinks is one of the greatest fighters of all time. And I think there's no doubt out of the greatest living fighters, I think he's top 5. He was an Olympic gold medalist. He dominated the light heavyweight division when the light heavyweight division was probably as good as it had been since like the 1920s or 1930s. Michael Spinks gets so underrated. It always annoys me, especially when you see Mike Tyson fans talk about it, because Michael Spinks' career was much better than Mike Tyson's. All right, guys, real quick, I want to remind you, betting.net finds the best promotions, offers, and bonus codes so you don't have to. Head over to the website now to take advantage of things like free bets and matching deposits. All right, guys, that brings us to number 6 on our list, which is Gerry Cooney. And Gerry Cooney was a guy who had some issues when fights went late, but he started off 1980 with a victory over Mike Koronecki. That was following 1979 when he lost a vacant shot, the vacated title by Muhammad Ali against John Tate in a horrible fight in Johannesburg, South Africa, I believe it was. And he loses that fight. He comes back. He stops Koronecki in 1 round. Koronecki's an all right boxer, nothing great. He gets a title shot against Mike Weaver. They fight that. I think that was in Sun City back in I think it was late 80, October of 1980. And it was actually a great heavyweight title fight. And I would recommend any of you guys to go watch that. It was a back and forth battle. I think Cooney controlled the fight up through about the 7th round. But from the 8th round on, it was all Mike Weaver. Weaver ended up stopping him. After that, he fights George Chaplin. George Chaplin, solid guy. I really thought he at least split the 2 fights with Greg Page. He came up on the short end in this fight, and Cooney dominated him. After that, we had to fight against Renaldo Snipes. I think this really affected Cooney getting a shot at Gerry Cooney because Renaldo Snipes got a title shot against Larry Holmes because Renaldo Snipes got a title shot off of this, and he shouldn't have because I think Cooney knocked him down twice, and he knocked him down in the 1st and I think 3rd or 4th round. And the scoring of the judges was an absolute joke. And they were guys that should have known better. They were, I think, Carol Castellano and Joe Cortez. And they scored this fight a draw, which I think is criminal when you rewatch the fight. So after that draw, he comes back. He beats Leroy Caldwell. Leroy Caldwell is a guy 27-25. But if you know anything about the heavyweight boxing scene, especially back on the West Coast back then, Leroy Caldwell gave everybody trouble. Cooney stops him in the 5th round. Cooney then beats an old version of Scott Ledoux, stops him in the 8th round. I think that was right after Ledoux had lost to Greg Page. But then you get a win against Stan Ward. Stan Ward, I think, is another guy that was underrated, and he destroyed Ward. He took Ward out in the 2nd round. And then we have issues again with judges. Pinklon Thomas, Gerry Cooney was a fight that was scored a majority draw. I think Cooney won that fight. I think it could have went either way. I don't think it was really as bad as the Snipes decision. And then Cooney gets fed to Michael Dokes. I say fed because I think Michael Dokes had won the heavyweight title against Mike Weaver in 2 fights that I think where referees were questionable in one and the judge's decision was questionable in the other. I really thought Don King thought that he could bring Gerry Cooney there as an easy mark for Michael Dokes. It wasn't an easy mark. As Cooney, I think, really dominated Dokes. He stopped Dokes in the 10th round, which leads us to the title defense against Greg Page. We already talked about that a little bit when we talked about our number 10 heavyweight, which was Greg Page. But Page Cooney was a good fight. I mean, a lot better than a lot of people thought it would be. I mean, Page came in at 236. Cooney was 218, but Cooney wore out. Page ended up knocking him out. Little controversy there, a lot of controversy there because the fight went much longer than 3 minutes. And in that 8th round, it went a lot longer than 3 minutes. Page knocked Cooney out. Cooney came back in Johannesburg again. He beats James Quick Tillis. James Quick Tillis, still a viable heavyweight. Remember, James Quick Tillis, I mean, less than a year after this fight against Cooney, where Cooney wins the unanimous decision, actually gave Mike Tyson a really good fight, probably 7-3, maybe even 6-4. And after that, you get a first-round stoppage of Frank Bruno a first-round loss to Frank Bruno in 1986. That was pretty much it for Harry Coetzee after that. But I think Coetzee, when you look at the win against Dokes, Stan Ward, I thought he beat Pinklon Thomas. I thought he beat Renaldo Snipes. I don't think he gets near the credit he deserves as a heavyweight contender back in the day and a partial heavyweight champion. Number 5, another addiction issue, Pinklon Thomas. Pinklon Thomas is a guy who really had the style to possibly beat Mike Tyson back then. He just didn't have the willpower to be able to work hard enough to do something like that. And Pinklon Thomas, to me, great jab. Angelo Dundee always said he had one of the best jabs he'd ever seen from a heavyweight. And he burst onto the scene in 1982 with an 8-round stoppage of James Quick Tillis. This was probably the best version of Tillis, too. Tillis was in shape at 216. He stops Tillis. Then he gets the majority draw against Coetzee. I do think Coetzee probably edged that fight out. But then he stops Alfonso Ratliff, beat your normal guys like Leroy Boone, the guys you got to beat to get a shot at the title. And then he gets a shot at the title, I believe it was August or September of 1984 against terrible Tim Witherspoon. And Witherspoon was coming off the year before the fight against Larry Holmes, which we'll talk a little bit about what we get to Witherspoon. But he ends up winning the WBC World Heavyweight title with a majority 12-round decision over Tim Witherspoon. He follows that up with an 8th-round knockout of Mike Weaver. Now people are starting to really think Pinklon Thomas could be the next big thing in the heavyweight division. Then he gets to Trevor Berbick. Against Trevor Berbick, he weighed more. He weighed in at 223. When you look at his best fights, the fight against Tim Witherspoon, the fight against Coetzee, the fight against Tillis, he was usually in the 214 to 215 range. I don't think he took Trevor Berbick seriously in that fight. It ended up biting him in the ass as Trevor Berbick beat him basically because he outworked him. And I really like Pinklon Thomas. We've had him on the Legends of Boxing show before. He's a great guy. He still thinks he won the Berbick fight, but I really don't think he did. The problem with him after that, the addiction issues took shape. He had an injury to his shoulder. He fought with a shoulder injury against Mike Tyson. And really, the judges had him winning, I think, 2 of the first 3 rounds against Mike Tyson. And you can see he kind of set the blueprint for what Buster Douglas would do a few years later. After that, he gets knocked out in, I think, 6th or 7th round by Evander Holyfield. Riddick Bowe stops him in 8. And really, he just becomes a gatekeeper for the heavyweight division after that. And it's a damn shame because Pinklon Thomas had a ton of natural ability. And when he was right, he was a damn good fighter. We're going to go to number 4, Tim Witherspoon. So when we look at Tim Witherspoon, same thing. But Witherspoon, I think the issues were Don King, the way he was treated. He was thrown in against Larry Holmes, and probably his best win was over Alfonso Ratliff. Now, Ratliff was a good fighter, but Ratliff was more of a cruiserweight. He actually weighed 190.5 pounds when he was beaten by Tim Witherspoon. And then he gets the title shot at Larry Holmes. And this is a fight that I always have arguments with people on because I do think Holmes edged it barely. But I know most of the people I know think that Tim Witherspoon deserved a decision in this fight. He had Holmes in all kind of trouble in the 9th round. But Holmes, as he often did, would recover, came back, won the fight, barely. After that, he fought Floyd Jumbo Cummings, who was a solid guy. He usually went the distance with most people. He went the distance with Witherspoon. And then Witherspoon beats James Quick Tillis. The difference here is this. Tim Witherspoon knocked out James Quick Tillis in the 1st round. Not a whole lot of people did that, especially in 1983. And then, of course, Witherspoon beats Page by a majority decision. It was a fight that I did think he won. So when he beat Page, he was at 220. He fought Thomas at 217. And then we really start to see the weight fluctuations where one fight he's 220, and the next fight he's 235. And the Pinklon Thomas fight, he lost on a majority decision. He was at 217. He was in shape. Pinklon Thomas was a good fighter too. Then he beats James Broad. James Broad, I always like to call him, they used to call him Broadaxe. I used to like to call him Broadass. But They fought that in Buffalo, and that was on the undercard of the other heavyweight title. I hate to call, Page and Tubbs a heavyweight title fight, but it was considered that at the time. He knocks out Broad in 2 rounds. He comes back. He beats James Bonecrusher Smith, who was a good fighter. Beats him by unanimous decision. The problem is this. When he fought Broad, he was at 222. When he fought Smith, he was at 221. His next fight after that, 235, 233. He gets a shot at Tony Tubbs. He weighs 225. He was a majority decision. He is he's a WBA heavyweight champion again. He defends the title against Frank Bruno. Bruno runs out of gas. Great fight at Wembley Stadium. He stops Bruno in 11 rounds. It looks like he's on a roll here. Then the problem is Bruno, he was 234. I don't think he took that seriously. Against Tubbs, he was 225, 226. Against James Bonecrusher Smith, he comes in at 233 pounds. Bonecrusher knocks him out in the first round. Suspicious fight. A lot of Don King stuff going on in the background there. Makes you wonder a little bit. He beats the undefeated Mike Williams. I think he won a split decision in 10 rounds. The thing about Tim Witherspoon, not a lot more happens in the 80s. You get the knockout over Anders Eklund, which was, what was that movie? The Great White Hype. They showed that as the black guy knocking out the white guy. Eklund got messed up big time. That was the end of the 80s for him. After that, when you get into the 90s, Tim Witherspoon was a guy who was good enough. Like 1992, he fought James Pritchard. James Pritchard was supposed to be really good. He beats James Pritchard. Beats Carl the Truth Williams on a split decision in 91. You go all the way up here. Levi Billups in 97. He beats Levi Billups. He takes Ray Mercer to distance in 96. I mean, he's a dude that no matter when he fought, he was always dangerous, even if he wasn't in shape. So my number 4 heavyweight of the 1980s is Tim Witherspoon. My number 3 heavyweight is Hercules, Mike Weaver, another guy who has been, just like Tim Witherspoon also, Tim Witherspoon, Pinklon Thomas, Mike Weaver, Larry Holmes, the guys on this list that we've actually interviewed on our Boxing Legends show. I would really recommend you go to thegruelingtruth.com. You just go in the search engine, punch in the fighter's name, and it'll come up. Number 3, Mike Weaver. Mike Weaver is a guy who started out his career. I mean, he lost a lot of fights early in his career. Nobody saw coming what would come starting in the late 70s. Of course, it's 79, and this isn't about this. So this didn't really have any bearing at all on this list, but almost beat Larry Holmes. He goes to Minnesota. He dominates Scott Ledoux, won the fight relatively easy, probably 10-2. You could have even said it was 12-0. They give him a shot against John Tate. John Tate's the home fighter, Knoxville, Tennessee. John Tate's 232 pounds. Big dude, can move. Was a 1986 Olympian, won the bronze medal. He was supposed to be the big thing. He'd beaten Harry Cooney to win the title. I think Mike Weaver was kind of cannon fodder to try to set up a John Tate versus Larry Holmes matchup. Mike Weaver, outweighed by 25 pounds, gets dominated for the first 12 or 13 rounds. Things pick up for him in the last couple rounds. Round 15, about 45 seconds left, one shot. He's the heavyweight champion of the world. He then goes to Johannesburg, South Africa, to fight Harry Cooney. Once again, he's at 210. Cooney is right around 230. He knocks out Cooney in the 13th round of a great fight that basically Cooney ran out of gas, and Mike Weaver takes him out. He then fights James Quick Tillis in Chicago, the Rosemont Horizon. I think that was the undercard to Hagler Ham Show 1, and it was a boring fight. James Quick Tillis was in there. It looked like just to survive. So Weaver wins that by a 15-round decision. And then you get Michael Dokes. Michael Dokes is a Don King fighter. Weird things happen with Don King fighters. Referee Joey Curtis stopped this fight after about a minute. Mike Weaver was the guy known for being able to come back from being knocked down or being hurt. He was not given that chance in this fight. It was really dirty the way he was done, the way Curtis did him. He was 209 there. Fast forward 8 months, he's put on about 8 or 9 pounds. Knowing him, it was probably muscle. You get the rematch with Michael Dokes, which I think was the undercard of Holmes Witherspoon. And this is a fight that is scored a draw. You had Jerry Roth, Harold Letterman, Larry Hazard, to 3 blind mice. Referee Richard Steele. What do you expect from a Don King promotion? I thought Mike Weaver won this fight. It was stolen from him by a majority draw. After that, he recovers with a win over Stan Ward, who he stopped at the 9th round. He loses to Pinklon Thomas. The loss to Pinklon Thomas makes it look like, this is the end of the road for Mike Weaver. He's had a good run. Pinklon knocks him out in the 8th round. Pinklon was in shape. Pinklon was as good as he ever was that night. But then he fights Carl the Truth Williams. Carl the Truth Williams is a guy who almost took out Larry Holmes when he got a shot at the title. I think it was in early 1985. A lot of people thought Williams maybe deserved the decision. Didn't get the decision. And Carl Williams is set up to fight against Mike Weaver. Everybody considers Mike Weaver done. Mike Weaver, with one punch, as he was apt to do, knocks out Carl the Truth Williams in the 2nd round, gets back in the game. But then he gets knocked out in the 1st round by James Bonecrusher Smith like 2 months later. Donovan Razor Ruddock wins a split decision over him, which was a great effort, really good fight. But then after that, not a lot more for Weaver in the 80s. He did beat James Pritchard, who was 15-0 at the time, and people really thought James Pritchard, since he was Louisville, Kentucky, just like Greg Page, everybody thought we might have something there. He was a guy built similar to the Burt Coopers and Mike Tysons of the world. Mike Weaver took him out in 6 rounds in his hometown. Then he beats Johnny Duploy in South Africa, Johannesburg. Follows that up, though, by losing on a 2nd round knockout to Duploy. That was pretty much it for Mike Weaver. All right, guys. So this brings us to 1 and 2. And the discussion with 1 or 2 is always the argument of Mike Tyson or Larry Holmes. And I can tell you how I went here. I went with Mike Tyson at number 2. And Mike Tyson was a force of nature in the mid to late 80s. I just think when you look at their careers and you match up early 80s to late 80s, I think Holmes beat the better competition. Now, I also do think there is an issue with Holmes not fighting the Greg Pages, the Michael Dokes of the world. No rematch for Tim Witherspoon. But I also think if you look at it after the Witherspoon fight, Holmes pulled away from Don King. And I think a lot of the reasons you didn't see him fight these guys is because he didn't want to deal with Don King anymore. He didn't trust him. From the times I've spoken to Larry Holmes, whether it's for interviews or just general conversation, was the fact that he didn't want Larry Holmes, or he didn't want Don King anywhere near him at that time. But when you look at Larry Holmes's career, you look at Mike Tyson's career, I mean, I can give you this. I believe that there is a huge case to be made for Mike Tyson here. So if you disagree with me on this, I have no problem with that, because Mike Tyson, to me, I mean, he was a force in the in the mid 1980s through the late 1980s. A lot of things happened that, let's face it, were probably within his control, though, guys. I mean, the example I always give is Michael Spinks against Dwight Muhammad Kwawi. His wife died 2 months before he fought Kwawi. That was still not enough to stop him from getting done what he needed to get done in the ring. Now, when you look at the competition he fought, James Quick Tillis, that was a fight scored 6-4 by 2 of the judges, 8-2 by the other. James Quick Tillis was a slick boxer, but a lot of guys had knocked Quick Tillis out a lot quicker than that. You look at Mitch Blood Green. Mitch at the time was 16-1. People act like Mitch ran. When you watch that fight, Mitch didn't run. And the other thing that strikes me is people talk about the head movement of Tyson. You go watch those fights. When guys are actually fighting Tyson and aren't afraid of him, that head movement was almost non-existent, even in his prime. Now, Marvis Frazier, 1st round knockout. Jose Revolta, tough-ass dude, goes to the 10th round, gets stopped. Alfonso Ratliff, Tyson knocks out quickly. Tyson knocks out Trevor Berbick. You have to respect that. Berbick's on this list. James Bonecrusher Smith, I like to call him. Bonecrusher didn't come to fight. My issue there is Tyson never figured out a way to, get away from him long enough to hit him and knock his ass out. You had the Pinklon Thomas win. I think that's a good win. Tony Tucker is a great win. Tony Tucker did give him problems in the early half of the fight, One of the judges, Billy Graham, actually scored the fight 8-4. I think it was more like 10-2 or 9-3. Then you get to Tyrell Biggs. Tyrell Biggs is a guy that I watched that fight the other day. Sugar Ray Leonard kind of thought Tyrell Biggs was going to beat him. A lot of guys did. And Tyson, I think the best Tyson I ever saw was against Tyrell Biggs. He bludgeoned Biggs. His skills were on point. His power was on point, and he totally dismantled Tyrell Biggs. All right. Now, the one thing you can say about that is, hindsight being 2020, Tyrell Biggs was more of an amateur than he was a professional. Then you get to the Larry Holmes fight, which from talking to Holmes and everything, that was kind of foisted upon him because he wanted to buy a hotel. So he had like a month to prepare. I think the 88 Holmes was kind of disillusioned with boxing, especially after the decision in the second Spinks fight, where I think he did win the fight. So I don't think comparing Mike Tyson knocking out in the fourth round, Larry Holmes in 1988, is the same as Mike Tyson fighting Larry Holmes in 1980. Tyson follows it up by knocking out Tony Tubbs in the second round. Tony came in at 238.5, where I think the rule was if he was under 230 or 235, he would have got like an extra $500,000, which will tell you how lazy and undisciplined he was. Then he fights Michael Spinks, knocks Spinks out in 91 seconds. I'll give it to him. Quality win, even though it is a blown up light heavyweight. Frank Bruno. Bruno actually buzzed Tyson to hurt him. This was different than the Bruno who fought him 6 years later, because I think that Bruno was afraid. This one wasn't, but Tyson took him out. Then he takes out Carl Williams. I think the fight was stopped too soon, but I don't think it would have mattered if it would have been or not. It still would have ended in the first round. So Mike Tyson, to me, is the number 2 heavyweight of the 1980s, which means y'all know what my number 1 is. My number 1 is Larry Holmes. Now, Larry Holmes, for my money, had one of the greatest jabs in boxing history. And the thing that really made this tight to me was Holmes, a lot of his better wins, like the Ken Norton, the 2 Ernie Shavers fights, the Mike Weaver fight, were all in the 70s. So that's what made this a close, tough call for me. And when you look at this, Lorenzo Zanon, Leroy Jones, Fat Dude, Scott Ledoux, Muhammad Ali, the Trevor Berbick wins solid. Berbick's on this list. Leon Spinks. Renaldo wins. Renaldo Snipes, solid win, solid fighter. The Gerry Cooney fight, to me, I think it's underrated. I think that was Holmes at his best. I think it was Cooney at his best. I think Cooney is a guy that's really underrated. The thing you can really see here, though, is the weight jump. After Cooney, he fights Randall Tex Cobb 6 pounds more. By the time he fights Lucian Rodriguez less than a year later, he weighs 10 pounds more. He's fighting guys like Scott Frank, Marvis Frazier, James Bonecrusher Smith, solid guy, but nobody knew that at the time. David Bay, Carl Williams. When I look at this, guys, I think what this came down to with me when you judge Holmes and Tyson is the simple fact, okay, we got a guy here that says Tyson's number 1. I'm not going to dispute that. I'm just going to give you my reason why, to me, it's Larry Holmes. I think when I do these lists, not too often does it come down to who would beat who, because I think styles make fights. That doesn't really judge what you did over a 10-year span in your career. But what it does come down to me when I look at it, this is so close that my answer is going to be here. I think Larry Holmes would have beat Mike Tyson. The simple fact, and I know you've all heard Teddy Atlas say it before, but when was Mike Tyson ever in trouble and won a fight? Now, we've got the guy here says Lennox Lewis, number 3. Lennox Lewis was fighting in the Olympics in 1988, so I don't think we can put him in a top 10 list of heavyweights of the 1980s. But we will do a top 10 heavyweights of the 1990s on Friday at 12:30 the same time. Make sure you stick back there, and you'll see where we rank Lennox Lewis as opposed to guys like, hell, Larry Holmes could have been in the list in the 90s damn near if he could have pulled out one of his 2 title defenses. But that'll be on the 1990s will be on Friday at 12:30. But to me, Larry Holmes, the thing that stood out to me, the Shavers, Weaver, Snipes, all fights when he was in desperate trouble. And even when he was in desperate trouble, Larry Holmes always figured out a way to win the fight. I don't ever remember seeing Mike Tyson do that. I just don't. And when you talk about, well, when he had Cus D'Amato and Kevin Rooney, he was great. Larry Holmes was rolling with Richie Giacchetti, who I don't think knew a whole hell of a lot. And if you think he did, remember this. At one point, Mike Tyson's trainer later in his career was Richie Giacchetti. So Larry had Eddie Futch in there. But then when Eddie Futch wasn't there, I mean, I put it like this, guys. Muhammad Ali had issues. Everybody, Joe Louis had issues. All these guys were able to overcome their issues because they were all-time greats. Mike Tyson was never able to overcome his issues. Nobody made him, get with Robin Givens and her mom. I know that sounds rude, but if you're getting with Robin Givens, her mom's going to be involved too. Maybe not sexually, but she'll be involved in sticking her hand in your pockets to get your money out. Nobody made him sign up with Don King. And I'm sure Cus D'Amato, Bill Caton, Jim Jacobs, all those guys constantly warned him about staying away from Don King. He did not do that. And I think in the end, that was his downfall, but that is his fault. That is his weakness. Larry Holmes was more of his own man. Larry Holmes made sure Larry Holmes had money. He took care of his money. He didn't have to fight YouTubers after he retired. He did fight Butterbean, but hell, he was like 50 and he beat the brakes off of Butterbean. But that's my number one. It's Larry Holmes. If you want to make the argument for Mike Tyson, that's fine. Just don't make the argument when we do the 1990s show. And if any of you think Mike Tyson was the greatest heavyweight of the 1990s, you could hit me up and we can have you on the show. But remember, guys, our top 10. Greg Page at number 10. Trevor Berbick at number 9. Evander Holyfield at number 8. Michael Spinks at 7. Harry Coetzee at 6. Pinklon Thomas at 5. Tim Witherspoon number 4. Mike Weaver 3. Iron Mike Tyson at number 2. And Larry Holmes at number 1. All right, remember, head over now and see for yourself. Betting.net makes it easy to find all the legal online casinos or sports books in your state. Make sure you check them out. Check out our new Twitter handle, which is grueling_truth. And I want to remind you, tomorrow at noon Eastern, myself and John Responding will be back for Inside Boxing Weekly to look back at last week's heavyweight fight between Derek Chisora and Kubrat Pulev, and to look ahead to Ryan Garcia against Javier Fortuna on Saturday night. Make sure you check out our Facebook page. But for now, this has been Mike Goodpaster for The Grueling Truth, where the